don't know if she wants to go first. If not, I'll go first. Do you want to go first?
You can go.
Okay.
No, you can go. Go ahead.
Okay. So for me out here, if that happens, quite honestly, that's a broker-to-broker conversation. So I'm definitely going to report it because that is illegal. So if I have a buyer that is qualified to purchase and everything is going and the seller finds out because of the color of their skin or their race that they don't want to sell to the person, then I'm getting my broker involved. And that is a conversation between broker and broker because it can go to the next level, which they could be reported. And then their license can be on the line. If the seller's agent, that listing agent, is allowing the seller to do that, because the listing agent, if I have a client and I'm representing a seller, let's just say, and they don't want to sell to somebody, it's the same thing. I cannot participate. I'm not going to participate and allow them to discriminate against someone else because of their color, their skin, or their race. I'm not going to put my license on the line. So if I have to take it and report that person, then that's what I'm going to do from my client, because if they're qualified to purchase it, it shouldn't matter, what they look like. If they're eligible and they're qualified, then let's move forward with the process.
I agree with her wholeheartedly, and my process would be the same. It's just extremely hard to prove.
Yeah.
Because there's so many things in the process that while we may know what's going on because we, see it, being able to prove that is very, very, very difficult.
And that's the hard part. That's just all of the stuff you're talking about, especially what you were talking about, Wavitra. You're talking about someone coming up and tapping on the window, telling you, not to sell.
Yeah,
to
that's crazy.
A particular family. But Chief, that harkens back to my old American constitutional law days.
Okay.
I remember one of the landmark cases back at Morgan State University.
Okay.
with the late Professor Gus Adair.
Oh, a legend.
Yeah, but one of the landmark cases having to do with this type of thing was Shelley versus Kramer, and it was a black family named Shelley that went to purchase a home in it was in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, and this was a long time ago, but not like super ancient history. This was like in the late 40s, and I think this was another case that Thurgood Marshall had been involved in as well. But it was the same kind of thing. There was a covenant that had been in place since 1911 that barred, as they called, people of color or people of the Negro or Mongolian race at that time from owning property. But the Shelleys had already purchased the home, but they didn't know about this racially restrictive covenant. But the thing existed. So it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court. And essentially the court found that racially based restricted covenants are not themselves unconstitutional because private parties can voluntarily adhere to them, but such covenants do go against the enforcement of such covenants go against the Equal Protection Clause. So they got around it. I mean, the Supreme Court, voted the right way, but their rationale was a little squirrely, but it still worked on in our behalf. But here you find, so back from the 1940s, and I'm sure probably before then, but from late 40s, and now you come up, everything changes. It may not exist in the same way. Like you don't have clear, blatant racism. You don't have too many cross burnings anymore. You don't have too many Klansmen walking around with hoods on, but you still have, things like the stuff that happened in Charlottesville. You still have these crazy things that happen that look similar, but they change the way that it is. And to Wavitra's point, it is hard to prove. Because how do you prove, that was something that they wanted, that people wanted, it's a hard thing to prove. But you can feel it. It's just something that you can feel like, I know what this is, and then do you want to go through with it? And then there's the other question. Do you really want to deal with living near folks who don't want you to live near them? And those kind of things. But what you're talking about too is the selling of the home. And I just, you got to really hate somebody to not want to sell to someone who has the money, who has everything lined up, and you can be on your way, but you don't want to sell to them because of the color of their skin. It's crazy.
Yeah. And I I know that it could be really hard to prove. I'm one of those people that you still got to report it, because if enough if enough people are reporting, and that's when they start to look into it. So that first time that someone might report it, nothing might happen, but you got to say something. And
I agree wholeheartedly.
You got to fight for it. You got to do something. It's when you say I don't want to be bothered is when you allow people to continue to treat people like that, which isn't right. But yeah.
So is it something that is? I know you're saying,
and it's more the client. So it is more so the client has to. So I guess from a realtor to kind of to answer Michael's question earlier too, is you give them the tools and point them into the direction of what they can do, because obviously they're the ones that have to do it. They have to be the ones to say that, hey, I was discriminated because of X, Y, and Z. And they have to state their case. And even if it's on a piece of paper the first time and they get a few people, but that's how you start getting class action lawsuits. And the same thing with the banks. If you are qualified and a bank is telling you all of a sudden that you're not qualified, you have to say something. You have to report it. Even if nothing happens at that moment for you, you still need to put it out there so that if enough people are reporting it, they can do an investigation and, get sued, basically. And that's how it's going to teach them to change their ways, honestly, is for the banks or whoever to be sued.
Right. So
yeah, I agree with that.
So do you find it? I know, Trina, you said on the West Coast you don't see it as often.
I think it's more so unintentionally is when it happens. It's not as blatant. Right. However, it's, I'm just going to even talk about areas of city of Las Vegas. I mean, that was a impoverished neighborhood, and you had investors come in. They kind of did the same thing. They're redlined at the area, right? And they said, hey, we're going to buy up all these houses, and we're going to invest in this area. And then those houses that was maybe $80,000, $100,000, now you probably can get the cheapest house is probably $220,000, $240,000 for a very small 1,200 square foot in downtown where they invested money. And you still have people who make $20,000, $30,000 that live there. They rent out the homes because they can't afford to buy something. And that same area, you have Life is Beautiful, right? So you got people who can't really afford to even go to that weekend event living in that same area. But you have, if you look at the pictures and stuff of who actually is able to attend, you have people who are middle class who can afford to spend $300, $400 for a ticket, not including a VIP. So redlining actually happens too, where, investors look at an area that's impoverished and they say, you know what, this is where we're going to go. We're going to buy up these houses and we're going to put money into these houses. And they make money that way as well. So in that case, it still does happen. That it's a little bit, people don't really think of it that way, but it definitely happens.
Yeah, that slides more into like gentrification at that point.
Yeah, agreed. Right. Yeah.
So then it becomes more of a question. So what happens, like other things, it ends up not so much being about race, but more so about class or economic status and the ability to purchase something. So that I guess that's, you get around the race thing in that way, but then it becomes a class thing, which is interesting. And then you slide from the redlining, which is more, which is obviously discriminatory in some ways, but then you get gentrification, which is not so much discriminatory. It's like, you can come, you can live here, but oh well, if you can't afford it, I guess you can't. Right. But it has, it's that kind of thing. Yeah. And the difference is, I think a lot of times people misconstrue revitalization and gentrification, because I think there's a part of revitalization. There's a part of gentrification that has to do with the displacement of people. Yeah. That revitalization does not. Revitalization is putting resources and everything into a particular community, but gentrification is like people coming in and jumping on land that was. It's almost viewed as like a good investment kind of thing.
Basically, yep. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you started heading in that direction with the gentrification piece, but before we get it totally in that direction, one of the things that we were talking about off the air, Trina Marie and I, was the George Wilborn case. Oh, yeah. And did you want to talk about that very briefly, Trina Marie?
No, I think you would probably do better explaining that. Okay.
Well, with the George Wilborn case, George was obviously eminently qualified to purchase a home. It was a very exclusive area of Chicago, and it was the house was in the millions of dollars, and he certainly had the money to afford it, and so there was no question about that. But as it turns out, they started doing those things that the ladies described earlier.
The seller, let's be specific.
Right. No, the ladies were talking about sellers, the little things that they do to kind of let you know we're going to do everything we can to see if we can sort of either discourage you or just outright make sure the sale doesn't happen. Right. And so, as Trina Marie said, George was just not having it and pushed the envelope and said, I'm going to sue. And he went into the courts, and he ultimately prevailed. But, the concerning thing about that, of course, was this was a guy that had a lot of money. Yeah. And then when you look at people who are just starting out, they're struggling to scrape up that $5,000 or whatever, those first time homebuyers programs that you described to us last week, or Vitra, it really doesn't give you the warm and fuzzies to know that a guy that has a couple of dollars is facing that type of nonsense. What does that say for me as, the little guy just trying to buy his first home?
It can be very discouraging for home buyers. And especially when, they go to banks that they, do business with and can get a credit card or a car loan, but can't get a home loan. And, it's like, it's okay for depreciating assets, but I'm not okay for something that's going to help me build wealth. And I can tell you that I've seen that quite a bit. Fortunately, I have some amazing lenders that don't do that at all. Like they are able to provide loans for people that should have gotten loans with some of your major financial institutions.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So, that's an interesting question. An interesting concept, Vitra. Are you also finding that perhaps, and I use the word perhaps, there have been some lenders who have sort of participated in this type of activity?
I think it happens across the board. I've seen it, I think it happens with lending, for sure. I've seen it. I think it's happened with, I've actually asked the question when I've had a client that could not get approved, and they should have, with an institution that they bank with, but another well-known bank, private lender not private lender, but, a lender is able to do it. And my question was, well, what's the difference? And they straight up told me they redline black people. And I was like, wow. And that was hard to hear, but it happens, but again, it's extremely hard to prove.
Wow. And is there identifying information? It's been a minute since I've done one of those, but is there identifying information that you can just tell right off the bat the race and ethnic origin of the buyer?
Sometimes it's not necessarily. Well,
sometimes the name.
Let's
just say it.
Of course, names and things like that, but also the area where they're trying to move.
Yes.
So in the DMV, if you're trying to move to Siouxland or District Heights, it may be something that something that they may look twice at.
It's straight no chaser. So you're telling me that when the application comes in and the application detective looks at it and sees Lemonitra, that goes off? That happens.
Just like a job interview.
Yeah.
Just
that
like
what
apply
happens?
for a job.
Again,
What was that name again, Chief?
Lemonita. You might as well
Lemonitra.
just say Vitra. I mean, but seriously, I think that